In 1878, a delegation of prominent citizens in Memphis, Tennessee, gathered to witness a demonstration of Thomas Edison's newest invention. The phonograph had been unveiled to the American public the previous year, and its demonstrators, traveling agents employed by Edison to introduce the device to audiences across the country, had developed a standard presentation designed to manage the specific quality of disbelief that the machine reliably produced in everyone who encountered it for the first time. The demonstrator spoke into the recording horn. The machine recorded. The demonstrator played it back. The room heard a voice coming from a machine. Not a voice transmitted through wire in the way that the telephone transmitted voices, a technology that had itself been received with significant skepticism just 2 years earlier. A voice stored. A voice captured from a moment that had passed and reproduced from a physical object that could be handled, examined, and played again. The delegation from Memphis listened to the playback. Then several of them walked to the front of the room, examined the machine from every angle, looked inside the horn, inspected the rotating cylinder, and announced their conclusion. The machine was a ventriloquist's trick. There was a man hidden inside it, or behind it, or somewhere in the room, producing the voice through concealed means. The mechanical reproduction of the human voice was not possible. They knew it was not possible because nothing in their experience of the physical world had prepared them for the possibility that it was, and therefore the demonstration they had witnessed was a deception. The demonstrator played it again. They remained unconvinced. He played it a third time, then a fourth. Several members of the delegation left the room. One reportedly refused to enter it again. This was not an unusual response. Across the United States, across Europe, across every community where the phonograph was demonstrated in its first years of public existence, the reaction followed a pattern so consistent that Edison's demonstrators came to expect it as a feature of the presentation rather than an obstacle to it. First, astonishment. Then, the specific, determined, intellectually defensive denial of people whose framework for understanding the world does not contain a slot for what they have just witnessed. Then, the search for the trick. And in the communities where the search for the trick failed to produce a satisfying explanation, in the rural American South, in parts of West Africa where the phonograph arrived with colonial administrators, in communities across the Islamic world where the device was introduced by merchants, the explanation that filled the gap was not mechanical. It was supernatural. And before this story is over, you will understand how a machine built to capture sound was banned, destroyed, and formally condemned across 3 continents, not because it failed to work, but because it worked so completely, so inexplicably, that the only available explanation, for millions of people who encountered it, was that something other than physics was responsible. To understand why the phonograph was terrifying, you have to understand what a recorded voice meant in a world where no recorded voice had ever existed. The voice is not, in the human experience of it, a mechanical phenomenon. It is the most intimate expression of individual identity that the body produces. It is recognizable across distance, across years, across the distortions of age and illness, in a way that the face is not always recognizable. It carries emotional information, fear, love, grief, anger, that the written word cannot fully convey, and that the face, at a distance, cannot transmit. The voice is, in every spiritual tradition that has ever engaged with the question of what constitutes a human being, something more than a physical process. In the Christian tradition, the voice is the vehicle of the word, the logos, the divine principle through which God created the world, spoken into existence. The voice of God is the most powerful image in the Hebrew Bible. The voice of the Holy Spirit, descending at Pentecost, is the transformative event of the New Testament. In Islamic tradition, the recited voice, the specific, trained, ceremonially produced voice of the Quranic reciter, is the most sacred form of human expression. The Quran is understood not primarily as a written text, but as a spoken one, and its recitation is a religious act of the highest significance. In West African traditional religious frameworks, the voice of an ancestor, heard after death, recognizable as the specific voice of a specific person who had died, was not merely a memory or an imagining. It was a communication from the spirit world, carrying the specific authority and the specific presence of the person who had died. Into all 3 of these frameworks, into the Christian South of the United States, into the Islamic communities of North Africa and the Middle East, into the traditional communities of West Africa, the phonograph arrived playing the voices of people who were not in the room. The voices of people who might be dead. The voices of people who had spoken into a machine weeks or months or years earlier, whose bodies had long since left the space in which the sound was produced, but whose voices, specific, recognizable, identifiably theirs, emerged from a brass horn and filled a room. The theological question this raised was not trivial. Where was the voice coming from? If not from the body, and the body was demonstrably absent, then from where? The formal religious responses to the phonograph were not confined to rural communities or uneducated populations. They were produced by the most sophisticated theological institutions of the era, applying the most refined analytical frameworks available to a genuine question about whether a new technology was compatible with the theological commitments of the communities that would encounter it. In Egypt and across the broader Islamic world of the 1890s and early 1900s, the phonograph generated serious jurisprudential debate among scholars of Islamic law, a debate that was not about whether the machine was witchcraft in the popular sense, but about whether the reproduction of the human voice through a mechanical device was compatible with Islamic principles regarding music, recitation, and the sacred nature of the spoken word. The specific question was whether the recorded voice of a Quranic reciter, played back through a phonograph, constituted a legitimate form of recitation, with the religious significance that live recitation carries, or whether it was a mechanical reproduction that lacked the spiritual dimension of the live act. This is not a superstitious question. It is a sophisticated theological question about the relationship between intention, presence, and sacred speech, a question that Islamic jurisprudence was, and remains, genuinely equipped to engage with. The initial rulings from significant scholars across Egypt, the Ottoman territories, and South Asia were mixed. Some scholars permitted the phonograph, reasoning that the mechanical reproduction of a voice was analogous to other forms of mechanical reproduction, printing the Quran, for instance, that had been permitted. Others prohibited it, arguing that the disembodied voice represented a category violation that Islamic law had not previously had occasion to address and could not permit without clearer guidance. In some communities, the prohibition was enforced practically. Phonographs were confiscated, destroyed, or formally banned by local religious authorities whose rulings carried the force of community governance in the absence of state-level adjudication. The debate was not resolved quickly. In some communities, it was not resolved for decades. The American response was less jurisprudentially sophisticated and more immediately visceral. In the rural American South of the 1880s and 1890s, communities where evangelical Protestant Christianity was the dominant cultural framework, where literacy was uneven, where scientific education was limited, and where the relationship between the human voice and the divine was understood in specific, literal terms, the phonograph generated a response that the traveling demonstrators documented with a consistency that makes the pattern unmistakable. The machine was the devil's work. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, as a literal theological claim. The device that captured and stored a human voice was doing something that only a supernatural power could accomplish, and the supernatural power that produced instruments of deception and illusion, that made impossible things appear to be real, was identified in evangelical Protestant theology with considerable specificity. In several documented cases across the rural South, phonographs were refused entry to towns. In others, demonstrations were shut down by community members who destroyed the equipment. In at least 2 documented cases, operators of phonograph equipment were threatened with violence and asked to leave communities that had determined, through their own theological reasoning, that the device's operation was incompatible with the spiritual safety of the community. The denominational leadership of several Southern Protestant churches issued formal statements addressing the phonograph, some cautiously permitting it, others warning against it, others explicitly condemning it. The specific theological concern was consistent across these statements. The voice, as the most intimate expression of the human soul, was not something that human technology should be able to capture, store, and reproduce. The ability to do so implied access to a dimension of human existence that was, by definition, not accessible to physical technology. If physical technology could do it, then either the theology of the voice was wrong, or the technology was not purely physical. The communities that chose the second explanation were not making an irrational choice within their framework. They were making the only choice their framework permitted. West Africa presented the phonograph with its most dramatically documented reception. Colonial administrators and missionaries who introduced the phonograph to West African communities in the 1890s and early 1900s recorded their experiences with a specificity, and, it must be noted, with the specific condescension of the colonial encounter, that preserves the reaction in some detail. The playback of a dead person's voice produced, in communities where communication with ancestors was a recognized and ritually structured activity, a response that the demonstrators had not anticipated and could not fully interpret. In several documented cases, the playback of a recorded voice was understood as an actual communication from the deceased, the phonograph as a device that had achieved, through means not fully explained, what ritual specialists in the community achieved through ceremony and spiritual practice. This interpretation was not, within the framework it emerged from, unreasonable. If the ancestors communicated through specific ritual conditions, and the phonograph created a condition under which a voice that should not be audible became audible, the inference that the phonograph had established contact was not a failure of reasoning. It was a reasonable application of an existing framework to a new phenomenon. The colonial encounter with the phonograph in West Africa is a document of the specific collision between frameworks, the mechanical and the spiritual, that the phonograph produced wherever it went, and it is a collision that the colonial record preserves only from one side, with all the distortion that implies. What the communities themselves made of the phonograph, how they incorporated it, rejected it, or transformed their understanding of it over time, is a history that the colonial record does not preserve with any fidelity. The theological objections to the phonograph did not prevent its adoption. They delayed it. In some communities, they shaped the terms on which it was adopted, the conditions under which its use was permitted, the content it was permitted to reproduce, the social contexts in which it was appropriate, and those in which it was not. The Islamic world's jurisprudential engagement with the phonograph eventually produced, across the 20th century, a nuanced and community-specific set of rulings that permitted the device while maintaining distinctions about its appropriate use, distinctions that continue to shape the relationship between recorded sound and religious practice in various Muslim-majority communities today. The Southern Protestant communities that had banned it as witchcraft were, within a generation, using phonographs to distribute recorded sermons, the very voice of the preacher, captured and reproduced, carrying the word to communities beyond the physical reach of the speaker. The technology that had been condemned as the devil's instrument became, within 20 years of the condemnation, a tool of evangelical mission. This is the pattern that runs through every technology in this series that was condemned on theological grounds: the telescope, the lightning rod, the printing press, the balloon. Condemned, resisted, adopted, eventually deployed in the service of the very institutions that condemned it. Because the technology does not care about the framework. It works regardless of what the framework says about it. And institutions that want to survive eventually recognize that the choice is not between having the technology and not having it. It is between using it and watching someone else use it instead. Edison did not design the phonograph as a spiritual provocation. He designed it to record telephone conversations, a dictation machine for business correspondence, a device for capturing verbal communication in a storable form. He did not anticipate the entertainment industry it would eventually create. He did not anticipate the record industry, the music industry, the broadcasting industry, the streaming platforms, the entire infrastructure of recorded sound that now constitutes one of the largest cultural industries on Earth. He certainly did not anticipate the theological controversy. When told that religious communities were condemning his machine as witchcraft, he is reported to have found this amusing. Edison's relationship with institutional religion was complex and mostly skeptical. He was not a man who spent significant time worrying about whether his inventions were compatible with the theology of the communities that encountered them. He was a man who was trying to make things work. The phonograph worked. What it did to the frameworks of the people who encountered it, the careful theological structures through which they understood the relationship between the voice and the soul, the living and the dead, the physical and the supernatural, that was not his concern. It was theirs. And the resolution, The process by which communities that had banned the phonograph as witchcraft eventually sat down in front of one and listened to it is not a story of those communities being proved wrong, or being educated out of their error, or being overcome by the inevitable march of technology. It is a story of frameworks adjusting, slowly, imperfectly, with genuine loss alongside the gain, because what the phonograph took from the communities that received it was not nothing. The voice of a dead person, in a world without recording, was a memory, imprecise, fading, colored by grief and time, and the specific distortions that loss introduces into recollection. In a world with recording, the voice of a dead person is a file, permanent, precise, playable on demand. The grief is the same, the loss is the same, but the relationship between the living and the dead, the specific texture of absence that memory used to fill, has been changed by a brass horn and a rotating cylinder in ways that the communities who heard the first playback were not wrong to find disturbing. They heard something new in the world. They reached for the frameworks they had. The frameworks were not adequate to what they were hearing. That inadequacy is not stupidity. It is the human condition, encountered at the edge of what has not yet been experienced. The Memphis delegation that walked to the front of the room and inspected the phonograph for a hidden man was not wrong to look. They were right to demand an explanation. They were right to refuse to accept a phenomenon without understanding its mechanism. They were right to suspect deception before accepting miracle. What they were wrong about was where to look. The mechanism was in the machine, not in a man hidden behind it, not in a supernatural agency that had taken up residence in a brass horn. In a cylinder, rotating, with a needle reading the physical trace of a sound wave pressed into tin foil. Mechanical, explicable, replicable. The explanation, when it came, was not less extraordinary than the miracle the Memphis delegation had suspected. A needle reading a groove and producing a voice. The miracle was real. It was just physics. And physics, as every technology in this series eventually demonstrates to every community that receives it with a framework inadequate to contain it, does not require belief. It only requires a cylinder, and a voice, and someone willing to press record.